Terminal lucidity. What does it teach us? A man with advanced dementia is nearing the end of his life. For a long time, meaningful conversation has largely disappeared. The disease has taken language, recognition, initiative, all the things his family once used to know that he was still fully there. And then one evening, something changes. He asks for a cigarette, then he asks for a beer. He sits with his wife and friends. He talks with them. He sings with them. For approximately 45 minutes, the man they remember seems to return. Not a random word, not a reflex, a conversation, preferences, music, social interaction, purpose. Then he goes to bed. The following morning, he dies. This is not a story collected from a Victorian book on the supernatural. It comes from a modern study of caregivers of people with severe dementia. And it raises one of the strangest open questions in neuroscience. If the disease had destroyed the capacities required to produce that evening, where did that evening come from? The phenomenon is usually called terminal lucidity. Researchers increasingly use the broader term paradoxical lucidity because these episodes do not always occur immediately before death. The description is simple. A person with severe dementia or another serious neurological condition has apparently lost abilities we associate with a functioning mind. Recognition, language, memory, awareness, meaningful interaction, sometimes for months, sometimes for years, and then, unexpectedly, some of it comes back, usually briefly, sometimes seconds, sometimes minutes, occasionally longer, and then it disappears again. For a long time, these accounts lived mostly in families, hospices, and old medical literature. Doctors heard them, nurses heard them, families never forgot them. Modern neuroscience did surprisingly little with them. That has started to change. In 2019, the United States National Institute on Aging helped launch a serious research effort into lucidity and dementia. And in 2024, researchers published detailed interviews with 30 family caregivers responsible between them for 29 people with severe dementia. 25 of those caregivers described at least one lucid episode, 34 episodes in total. 21 lasted only seconds, a word, a phrase, a meaningful look, a gesture. 13 lasted minutes or longer. One of them was the man you just met, and the behaviors described across the episodes were not all vague. Recognition returned. Awareness of surroundings returned. People responded appropriately to the emotions of others. Some displayed purposeful, goal-directed behavior. And already we have a problem, because dementia is usually imagined as a process of subtraction. Neurons die, connections disappear, networks fail, memory is lost, language is lost, recognition is lost. Eventually, the person we knew seems to disappear behind the disease. That picture is not wrong. Neurodegeneration is real. Brains with advanced Alzheimer's disease can show extensive pathological changes. But terminal lucidity introduces a much stranger question. What exactly do we mean when we say a function has been lost? Imagine a woman with severe dementia who no longer recognizes her daughter. Days pass, months. Her daughter enters the room and there is no sign of recognition. Eventually, everyone naturally concludes that the memory is gone. Then one afternoon, the woman looks directly at her daughter, recognizes her, responds appropriately, perhaps even says her name. What just happened? Recognition does not require a perfect memory to have been sitting somewhere untouched. The brain can reconstruct from fragments, emotion, and context. But that only pushes the problem one step back. Enough information, enough structure, and enough functioning machinery still had to survive to produce recognition at all. And when what returns is not one memory, but intention, humor, autobiography, language, and social awareness at the same time, reconstruction itself becomes the thing that needs explaining. That leaves us with two ideas we routinely treat as though they mean the same thing. The person cannot access the capacity no longer exists. Those are different statements. A locked room and an empty room may look identical from the hallway. You cannot see anything inside either one, but they are completely different situations. Terminal lucidity may be telling us that, at least sometimes, we have mistaken the locked room for the empty one. This is where the phenomenon becomes much more than a strange event before death. Because if apparently lost cognitive abilities can return, even temporarily, then advanced dementia may involve more than irreversible destruction alone. There may also be disconnection, failed access, failed coordination, networks that still contain useful information but can no longer communicate effectively. Researchers have proposed that some lucid episodes could involve a temporary restoration of large-scale network function, not new neurons appearing, not years of damage being repaired in 5 minutes. A temporary change in how surviving systems interact. Something reconnects, something synchronizes, something inaccessible becomes accessible. That is probably the strongest conventional direction available to us. And it is genuinely interesting, because if it is correct, terminal lucidity is not a curiosity. It is a clue. It would mean that at least some cognitive loss in severe dementia may be functionally hidden rather than completely destroyed. And if scientists could discover what temporarily restores that access, the implications would reach far beyond people at the end of life. Imagine discovering that the brain still contains islands of preserved memory and identity that we simply do not know how to reach. Terminal lucidity might then reveal not how the mind returns before death, but how parts of it remain inaccessible during disease. And this is the part that should stop us. Because when these episodes occur, what returns is often not just raw information. It is not like somebody suddenly remembering the capital of France. Families describe something much more integrated. Recognition, humor, emotion, intent, social awareness, preferences, autobiographical memory, the ability to understand what another person is saying and respond meaningfully. In other words, the thing that sometimes seems to return is not one isolated cognitive function. It is the person. That wording can sound sentimental, but it points to a real scientific problem. The self we experience is not located in one neuron. There is no tiny person sitting somewhere behind the eyes. A coherent identity depends on many systems working together. Memory has to connect with perception, language with intention, recognition with emotion, attention with context, past with present. For someone who has lost meaningful communication to suddenly produce a coherent interaction means that several functions must become available together, at the right moment, in the right context, coordinated with one another. That is much harder to explain than a random word. The remarkable part is not that one circuit briefly fires. It is the temporary reappearance of an integrated mind. And this is where the timing becomes fascinating. Some lucid episodes happen months before death. So death itself cannot be the complete explanation. But a subset occurs very close to death. Hours, days, sometimes apparently during the final decline. And that creates an almost backwards relationship. The body is not recovering. The brain is not becoming younger. The disease has not suddenly reversed. Physiologically, the patient may be getting worse. Yet mentally, for a brief period, they get better. There are possibilities, changing neurotransmitter levels, altered arousal, changes in inhibition, stress hormones, inflammatory changes, shifts in metabolism, temporary recruitment of surviving networks. There may eventually be a very elegant neurological mechanism, but giving the possibilities names is not the same as having the mechanism. At present, we do not know what produces these episodes. If disinhibition explains it, show the circuit and show why disinhibition produces coherence rather than noise. If network reconnection explains it, show the network and show what triggers the reconnection. If a neurochemical surge restores function, show how that change brings recognition, language, autobiographical memory, and social awareness back online together. In a severely damaged system. That is not hostility toward neuroscience. That is what neuroscience is supposed to do. There is a useful analogy. Imagine a computer that has slowly become less functional. Files stop opening. Applications fail. Eventually, the screen barely responds. There are at least two fundamentally different reasons this can happen. The data itself may be destroyed, or the machinery required to access the data may be failing. From outside, both can look similar. Click the file. Nothing happens. But if the supposedly destroyed files suddenly open again for 10 minutes, you have learned something. Maybe not exactly where the problem is, but complete destruction becomes harder to defend. The human brain is obviously not a laptop, but the distinction remains useful. Terminal lucidity asks whether some abilities we classify as gone are actually unavailable. And if that is true, then our understanding of advanced dementia changes immediately. The silent patient may possess more preserved internal structure than their behavior allows us to see. The person who does not respond may not be equivalent to a person in whom nothing meaningful remains. And that is not merely philosophical. It changes how we treat people, how we speak around them, how families interpret a look, how caregivers understand moments of connection, how confidently we decide what remains of someone's inner life. There is an old case that pushes this mystery even further. Her name was Anna Katharina Emmer. She died in 1922 at the age of 26. She had profound developmental disabilities and lived in a German institution. According to the institution's physician and director, Anna had never learned to speak. They reported that shortly before her death, she suddenly began singing, not meaningless sounds, songs about dying, for approximately half an hour. Then she died. The case was reconstructed from historical testimony, so it cannot give us the kind of controlled medical data we would demand today. But it belongs to a much older record of similar events involving dementia, strokes, brain tumors, severe psychiatric illness, and neurological disease. People have been noticing something like this for generations. Only recently have we begun asking what it might actually mean. Perhaps the most conservative lesson is already a significant one. Behavioral absence does not necessarily mean cognitive absence. A capacity can apparently be invisible for a long time, and then become visible again, which means our measurements matter. If all we can measure is output, speech, movement, recognition, response, then a loss of output can look exactly like a loss of mind. Sometimes we may only have measured the failure of the channel, and now we arrive at the uncomfortable part. There are two very different ways this could ultimately be understood. The first keeps everything inside the brain. The mind is generated by neural activity. Advanced dementia destroys enormous amounts of the system, but some important information and functional capacity survive. Most of the time, those surviving pieces cannot coordinate. During a lucid episode, for reasons we do not yet understand, enough of the network reconnects to temporarily recreate coherent cognition. If that model is correct, terminal lucidity may eventually teach us astonishing things about redundancy, memory, network organization, and recovery. It could even reveal therapeutic possibilities. That would be an extraordinary result. But there is another possibility, and we should be allowed to ask it. What if the relationship between brain and mind is not simply one of production? What if the brain also constrains, organizes, filters, or provides access to the mind? Under that kind of model, damage to the brain would still produce what we observe. Damage the machinery, and expression changes. Memory becomes inaccessible. Personality changes. Communication fails. Conscious experience may become fragmented. But the deeper informational structure of the person would not necessarily have to be identical to the damaged machinery through which it is normally expressed. Then a moment of terminal lucidity could be interpreted very differently. Not as a damaged brain somehow rebuilding the person for 45 minutes, but as a temporary change in what prevents that person from being fully expressed. And here is the one caution this film actually needs. Terminal lucidity does not tell us which model is correct. By itself, it cannot establish a survival after death or a non-local mind. Both models can accommodate the same 45 minutes, but they do not necessarily predict the same brain activity during those 45 minutes. And that gives us a real question to test. When coherent cognition returns, does the large-scale network integration, connectivity, and complexity normally associated with coherent cognition return with it? Or can recognition, autobiographical memory, purposeful conversation, and a coherent sense of self reappear without a corresponding restoration of those large-scale neural dynamics? That is no longer a philosophical distinction. It is, at least in principle, measurable. High-density EEG, perhaps functional imaging, continuous monitoring of patients likely to experience lucid episodes. Catch the mind returning, and watch what the brain does at exactly the same time. If the missing network organization returns with the person, the neural reconstruction model becomes much stronger. But if coherent cognition returns while the large-scale neural signatures normally associated with that coherence do not, then something far more interesting has happened. The observation would no longer merely need explaining. Our model of the relationship between brain and mind would need changing. We have not yet captured these episodes with the kind of measurements needed to settle that question. But that does not make the question empty. It makes it testable. So where does the evidence leave us? If I score the phenomenon itself, whether terminal and paradoxical lucidity are genuine events that deserve explanation, 99% out of 100. The reports are too recurrent, too structured, and now too seriously studied to dismiss as nothing. But if I score the much stronger claim, that terminal lucidity by itself is evidence that the mind exists independently of the brain, 45 out of 100. Interesting. Enough to keep the model on the table? Nowhere near enough to decide the case. And that distinction matters, because terminal lucidity does something scientifically valuable long before we ever settle the metaphysics. It stops us pretending that the simplest version of the problem has already been solved. Whatever model of mind and brain we eventually accept, it has to explain this, not explain it away. Explain it. So what does terminal lucidity actually teach us? First, lost function may not mean lost information. Something we believe destroyed may sometimes remain inaccessible. Second, the relationship between visible brain damage and remaining mental capacity is not simple. What a person can show us may be a poor measure of everything that remains available inside the system. Third, the self appears more resilient than its outward expression. Recognition, humor, intention, memory, and emotional connection can sometimes reappear together after long periods in which they seemed absent. Fourth, dementia may involve problems of access and network organization alongside irreversible tissue loss. And if we can discover how that temporary access is restored, terminal lucidity may eventually teach us something practical about treating cognitive decline. But there is one final lesson, and I think it is the deepest. For years, a family can sit beside someone they love and watch piece after piece disappear. The name, the memories, the conversations, the jokes, the familiar look in the eyes. Eventually, it becomes natural to think that the person themselves has disappeared. The brain is damaged, the functions are gone, therefore the person is gone. And then, sometimes for only a few seconds, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for an evening, that person looks back, recognizes someone, makes a joke, asks for something, sings a song, says goodbye. Whatever terminal lucidity eventually turns out to be, that single fact should make us more careful with the word gone. Because perhaps the greatest mistake we have made is assuming that when we can no longer reach a mind, there is no mind left to reach. Perhaps terminal lucidity is not remarkable because a dying brain suddenly creates one final person. Perhaps it is